Did Jesus truly rise from the dead? Imagine a man is publicly executed, tortured, pronounced dead, buried. And then, 3 days later, his followers claim he walked out of his tomb. Here's the question that has divided historians, theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people for 2,000 years. Is that story true? Not just spiritually meaningful, not just metaphorically powerful. Actually, literally true. Because if it is, it changes everything. About death, about God, about you. And if it is, then Christianity, the largest religion in human history, stands on a false foundation. There is no comfortable middle ground. Either the tomb was empty for a reason, or it was. So let's take the question seriously. Let's examine the evidence honestly. Let's listen to skeptics and believers alike, and then let's think. To understand the claim, we have to go back 2,000 years, to Jerusalem. It is the spring of approximately AD 30 to 33. The Roman Empire governs Judea. A Jewish teacher named Jesus of Nazareth has drawn large crowds, healing the sick, teaching with unusual authority, and making claims that unsettled the religious establishment. The Jewish leaders bring him before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Under political pressure, Pilate sentences him to crucifixion, Rome's most brutal form of execution. Now here is what we know from sources outside the Bible. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around AD 116, records that Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilatus. Tacitus refers to Pilate as a procurator, though inscriptions show his official title was prefect. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, also references Jesus and his execution under Pilate. Scholars debate later Christian additions to that passage, but most agree Josephus originally mentioned Jesus' crucifixion. So the crucifixion itself is not seriously disputed by contemporary historians. What is disputed is what happened next. There are serious historians, philosophers, and scientists who do not believe Jesus rose from the dead. Their arguments deserve a fair hearing. One explanation is the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus never truly died. Proposed in various forms since the 18th century, it suggests he lost consciousness, was mistakenly declared dead, revived in the tomb, and later appeared to his followers. But Roman executioners were professionals. Crucifixion was engineered to ensure death. The accounts describe soldiers refraining from breaking Jesus' legs, a practice called crurifragum, because they believed he was already dead, and one soldier pierced his side with a spear. Even setting theology aside, surviving crucifixion, blood loss, trauma, and 3 days without treatment would leave a man barely alive, not appearing as the conqueror of death. For that reason, most modern critical scholars, including skeptical ones, reject the swoon theory. Another explanation is that the disciples stole the body. If that were true, the disciples would have knowingly fabricated the resurrection. Yet historical evidence strongly supports that several early Christian leaders, including Peter, Paul, James the brother of Jesus, and Stephen, suffered persecution and death for their proclamation. People can die for beliefs that are mistaken, but it is exceedingly rare for people to willingly suffer and die for something they know is a deliberate lie. There's also a practical problem. If guards were asleep, how did they know who stole the body? A third explanation is hallucination. Perhaps the disciples sincerely believed they saw Jesus, but these were grief-induced visions. Hallucinations are real. Bereavement experiences happen. This theory takes the disciples' sincerity seriously. But hallucinations are typically private experiences. They do not usually occur to groups, and certainly not to hundreds at once. In 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, Paul quotes an early creed stating that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at one time. Paul writes this letter around AD 55, and scholars widely date the creed itself to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion. This is not a legend centuries later. This is testimony circulating while eyewitnesses were still alive. Even agnostic New Testament scholar Bart D. Ehrman affirms that Paul genuinely believed he encountered the risen Jesus. Hallucinations also do not explain the empty tomb. If the body remained, authorities could have produced it and ended the movement immediately. Another proposal is the wrong tomb theory, that the women simply went to the wrong burial site in the early morning darkness. But this would require multiple individuals, including disciples and authorities, to perpetuate the same geographical mistake. And again, producing the correct tomb and body would have resolved the issue instantly. Then there is the legend theory. Perhaps the resurrection narrative evolved gradually over decades. This position is often associated with scholars like Bart Ehrman and others who argue that stories about Jesus developed over time. But legends require time. The creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15 is widely dated by critical scholars to within just a few years of the crucifixion. That timeline is extraordinarily early by ancient historical standards. And the nature of the resurrection claim, bodily, physical, occurring in recent history, differs significantly from mythological dying and rising god cycles in the ancient world. It is also important to acknowledge the Islamic perspective. Nearly 2 billion Muslims revere Jesus as a prophet, but reject his crucifixion and resurrection. The Quran, in Surah 4, 157, states that Jesus was not killed or crucified, but that it was made to appear so, and that God raised him up. This is not primarily a historical counterargument, but a theological conviction grounded in a different revelation. It deserves respect, even where disagreement remains profound. So what is the positive case for the resurrection? First, the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul writes that he received and passed on this tradition, language indicating an earlier source. Most scholars place Paul's meeting with Peter and James around AD 35-36, within just a few years of the crucifixion. The resurrection proclamation begins almost immediately. Second, the empty tomb. Even early opponents claimed the body was stolen, an admission that the tomb was empty. The burial by Joseph of Arimathea appears across multiple sources. The discovery of the empty tomb is attributed to women, whose testimony, in many first-century Jewish and Greco-Roman contexts, carried less legal weight than men's. That detail would be unlikely to be invented for credibility. Third, the resurrection appearances. Multiple sources describe appearances to individuals, small groups, and larger gatherings. The accounts vary in detail, sometimes even awkwardly so, which is often a mark of independent testimony rather than coordinated legend. Fourth, the transformation of the disciples. After the crucifixion, they were afraid, scattered, hiding. Within weeks, they were publicly proclaiming the resurrection in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been executed. What caused that shift? Fifth, the conversion of skeptics. Paul of Tarsus, once a persecutor of Christians, claimed he encountered the risen Jesus and became Christianity's most influential missionary. James, the brother of Jesus, is portrayed in the Gospels as a skeptic during Jesus' ministry. Yet he later became a leader in the Jerusalem church and died for his faith. What explains those conversions? Serious scholars continue to debate these questions. N.T. Wright argues in The Resurrection of the Son of God that the empty tomb and appearances provide the best historical explanation for the rise of early Christianity. Gary Habermas has surveyed critical scholarship and argues that several core facts, Jesus, death by crucifixion, the disciples, belief in resurrection appearances, Paul's conversion, are accepted by the vast majority of scholars, even if they disagree on the explanation. Even Bart Ehrman agrees that the disciples genuinely believed they saw Jesus alive. History cannot prove a miracle the way a laboratory experiment can be repeated. The resurrection is not claimed as a recurring natural event, but as a singular act of God in history. The historian's task is more modest, to weigh explanations and ask which best accounts for the data. We can say with reasonable historical confidence that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that his followers soon proclaimed he was risen, that several key figures were transformed by experiences they interpreted as encounters with the risen Christ, and that this proclamation began in Jerusalem within a remarkably short time frame. Every alternative theory must account for all of those facts together. For some, a natural explanation, however complex, will always be preferable to a supernatural one. And that reveals something deeper. Our conclusion about the resurrection is not shaped by evidence alone, but also by what we believe about the possibility of God. If miracles are impossible by definition, then the resurrection cannot be true, regardless of the evidence. But if God exists, then the question becomes historical. Did he act here? 2,000 years ago, a tomb was found empty. Skeptics have offered explanations. Believers have offered theirs. Serious scholars remain divided. This debate is not settled by intelligence alone, but by how one weighs historical probability and metaphysical possibility. You don't have to accept the resurrection, but you owe it to yourself to examine it carefully. Because if the tomb was empty for the reason the earliest Christians claimed, then this is not just ancient history. It is an invitation. An invitation to consider that death is not the final word, that the story did not end on a cross, and that the question of that empty tomb still confronts every generation. So I leave you with this. What do you do with an empty tomb? Think deeply, weigh carefully, and keep asking honest questions. The truth can withstand them,